Hello everyone and welcome to this first in a series of webinars from the GSMA's AI for Impact team. The series theme will be on using mobile big data analytics to combat global challenges, including COVID-19. Moving on to the agenda to give you an overview of what we're intending to cover in today's first session. So a quick look at the agenda before we launch into the session itself. So first of all, myself, Rob Childs, Strategic Engagement Lead for the GSMA's AI for Impact team. I'll be giving a quick overview of the AI for Impact initiative itself and an introduction to mobile big data. Then I'll be inviting my colleague Charlie Harrison, Dr. Charlie Harrison, to talk about the technical delivery and adoption aspects that are relevant in using mobile big data analytics. My colleague Jade Nestor, who's the Director of Consumer Policy here at the GSMA, will be talking around some of the main policy and privacy considerations. And then finally, my colleague Hilary Kemp, the Strategic Product Manager here in AI for Impact, will give some considerations to the funding and sustainability elements that are involved and requirements around mobile big data analytics. So without further ado then, I'll launch into the first section. So moving on to the next slide, please. Just very quickly, already mentioned, myself, Rob Childs. So we wanted to start by giving you an overview around the mobile industry's purpose and the rationale behind the AI for Impact initiative. So back in March 2016, the mobile industry was the first sector as a whole to commit to accelerating impact achievement against the United Nations 17 Sustainable Development Goals. The mobile industry in this context seeks to accelerate and scale mobile initiatives that really are able to address and tackle the most critical challenges that are facing our planet at the moment. In order to be able to achieve this, the AI for Impact initiative was created. And through this has developed a number of global partnerships to accelerate action and also achieve impact in alignment with the UN SDGs. This GSMA initiative, which is guided by a task force of 21 mobile operators and an advisory panel of 12 United Nations agencies and partners, works together to define the technical, commercial and ecosystem requirements that are required to deliver viable data-driven products and services, whilst also adhering to a set of principles around privacy and ethics. Through the AI for Impact program itself, the GSMA shares experiences and promotes best practices amongst key stakeholders. So, for example, I've worked to establish a common framework that is both consistent and replicable across geographies, operators and use cases that will help to accelerate the adoption of mobile big data solutions and drive progress towards the SDGs. Also focus on raising awareness of the range of applications of mobile data analytics and the opportunities for adopting these data-driven decision support systems. And at the national level, the GSMA supports real-world implementations. So working with operators and government partners to replicate proven models and deliver market-shaping campaigns that can unlock demand and address some of the barriers that remain to adoption. So moving on to the next slide, before going into some of the more technical detail, the policy side, and also looking at the sustainability and the funding elements, useful to start with a baseline to give a fundamentals around what is big data in the context of mobile networks. So every day, mobile networks are generating enormous volumes of data as a result of the normal use of phone services by consumers. By combining this data with other sources of information and analyzing the patterns and flows, unique insights and powerful decision support tools have the potential to be developed. This data-driven output is really able to assist decision-making across a wide range of problems, for example, mitigating pollution, to determining how best to respond to natural disasters and epidemics, such as the coronavirus crisis that we collectively face. But before we go any further, as I mentioned, let's go into a little bit more detail around what big data actually means. It's a relatively new phrase. It still and has a number of definitions, and it's often used in a rather catch-all way to refer to a number of things. So let's start by describing some of the key features of big data. So first of all, it's important to note that big data itself is natively digital. If we could move to the next slide, please. So being natively digital means that it doesn't need to be re-recorded, encoded, or converted. In fact, it's ready to be fed into an analytics pipeline at the point of collection. And there are many modern systems that produce natively digital data. Examples obviously being the mobile networks, but also the banking system and also the internet has these same properties. The next few slides will try to explain the key properties around big data and what it means, what makes it different from those traditional or more traditional data sources. So moving on to the next slide. Big data is characterized by the 4 V's, and references to big data therefore generally involve large data quantities from multiple diverse data sources. In that instance, we're referring to the volume and the velocity and the variety of information. This big data is created in near real time, which refers to the velocity element. And the use of data processing techniques that analyze the data, identify correlations, and generate what are often potentially unexpected insights that might have a predictive quality. Moving on then to the next slide, taking a quick look at volume and velocity. So first of all, volume, as the name implies, big data itself is very large. It takes up a significant amount of storage space when being saved on a disk, and it updates and expands rapidly. And this means that powerful computing resources, specialized software, and techniques are required to be able to process and analyze it effectively. The velocity element of big data, it means it's incredibly fast. Mobile networks, to give some kind of sense of scale, commonly process billions of events every day and possess the infrastructure to be able to manage and organize the amount of traffic and the data that this actually generates. Moving on then to variety. Variety refers to the fact that the data is made up from a number of different data types and follow different structures and formats. So this needs to be managed separately with the ability to be able to then combine them when they're appropriate. In the context of a mobile network, there are broadly 3 types of data. You have event data, which provides timestamped locations of specific customers. You'll have information on network topology, which gives geographical locations. And you also have an element of customer profile data, which provides an enriched picture of the types of people that are actually using the network. And each of these have different natural structures and processing systems that support them. So the event data, those events sit in stores or data streaming platforms with very high data writing capabilities. In terms of network topology, which references the geographical locations, given that it has this strong geographical component and processing, it typically requires geographical information system capabilities, or GIS systems as they're often referred to support with that processing and visualizing the data. And then that customer profile data element, that's typically tabular and relatively static, and more often than not doesn't need to be updated or isn't updated frequently. So that sits very well in a standard relational database management system, so a SQL database, for example. Moving on then to veracity of the data. This is all about how trustworthy the data is. It is possible to find many answers in big data, but to be able to do this effectively, it's actually crucial that we ask the right questions. The complexity of the systems that generate big data can hide a very surprising number of variations of noise, sources of bias or error. So when data is used, for example, if we want to use data to find out how many people made a call in a particular place in a certain time period, there are a number of sources of noise that need to be understood, quantified, and mitigated against for the data to be used safely and reliably. For example, when we ask of the data how many people made calls in a certain region on one day, what we're really asking is how many SIM cards made calls in that period. And of course, we have to consider that SIMs might be shared between multiple users. Individuals might have multiple SIMs across different carriers. And additionally, there may be biases in the customer base versus the wider population. So to give a bit more color around that, network issues may lead to dropped or duplicated traffic of calls. Cell towers and base stations are given IDs in the network, which may be assigned when a network is upgraded, which can cause inconsistencies in the locations associated with events. And similarly, the phone numbers associated with SIM cards are limited. and are so sometimes reused if a subscription is cancelled. In addition, dwelling on the edge of two cell coverage areas can lead to handover events that need to be accounted for when the data is analysed. Finally then, the organic nature of big data. Data is organic. It means that it's passively generated by normal natural behaviours. It's not something that's recorded specifically on request or even with the explicit intention of collecting the data. It is very different, for example, from data that is obtained from a survey, which are explicitly designed to deliver answers to specific questions. Organic data then has different properties to that designed data. Designed data in itself contains a lot of useful information, but is set and designed to answer a very narrow set of questions. So you have to be sure you're asking the right question to get the right insight from the survey. Whereas the organic data, such as the data generated by the mobile network, is unusually large in its raw form in itself, but many, many more questions can be asked and answers and insights are able to be extracted from it. And it's also possible, therefore, to discover new things and new relationships that you may never have thought of originally asking as a question. And this feature of big data opens up unique insights to otherwise invisible patterns, and without including the individual biases that are associated with the deliberate data collection from surveys, as we mentioned. So to summarize the points from the last 3 or 4 slides, in this context, big data refers to large volumes of network data that's created by mobile networks as a result of their daily function of providing connectivity and delivering communication services. Mobile big data is clearly huge. It expands rapidly. Is passively generated through normal natural behaviors and is combining different types of data, which includes information on user location, social connections, profile data, usage, and also consumer spend. In its raw form, big data from mobile networks contains a noise and errors that need to be understood and accounted for. And insights that can also be gleaned from this data may not have been intended to be used in this way in its original sense. Moving then on to bring that a little bit more to life, like to show you some examples of where data can potentially be used across a range of development problems. And there are a very wide range of development and humanitarian challenges that can potentially benefit from the insight that's derived using big data. A number of the SDGs can be informed by the greater granular population density information that mobile networks can provide, the population movement information, and the other associated data that mobile networks are able to supply. So you'll see there are several themes, and I won't go through them all here specifically, but there are sub-theme boxes beneath those that illustrate specific use cases for mobile big data. And each of these are real projects and implementations of mobile data where studies have been publicly published. They each address a real, genuine problem that's faced by a geography, be that a country or a city. And the range of use cases shown in the framework above is also quite broad. It includes ranging from long-term infrastructure planning applications, for example, where to site a school, a hospital, to best serve the population, how to plan a transport network. And it also includes more shorter-term applications, for example, how to understand where people are located immediately after a disaster that will enable more rapid evacuation or the deployment of emergency supplies as and where needed. Of course, this isn't an exhaustive list, the use cases either. New applications are already being explored, new models and predictions are being created using this rich source of data. And so part of the reason for showing this is also to we want to also highlight that this application is also very relevant, therefore, in the context of COVID-19 pandemic that we're currently experiencing. So moving on to the next slide. In the context of COVID-19, the COVID-19 pandemic, many operators are working with a number of national authorities to really try to leverage their big data analytics and AI capabilities to support those governments to understand the mobility and movements of volumes of people, and to be able to inform and evaluate the interventions and decisions that are being made. In the case of disease outbreaks, mobility is a very critical factor and extremely relevant, given the fact that mobility contributes to the spread of human-transmitted infectious viruses. And so being able to obtain accurate and up-to-date information on these aggregate mobility patterns is potentially really vital for monitoring, predicting the outbreak, looking at logistics for provision of medical supplies and staffing, and equally where to deploy critical healthcare infrastructure. So a number of operators globally are delivering services. There are examples from Telenor in Norway working with the National Institute of Public Health. In Italy, Vodafone are working with the regional authorities and the Civil Protection Agency. Orange in France are working with INSERM. Telia in the Nordic countries are providing insights on trips. So that's across Norway, Denmark, Sweden and Finland. In Mexico City, antenna data is being used from local operators there. In Ghana, Vodafone are providing data that is used to develop mobility indicators for the Ghana Statistical Service. There are many more examples that I could carry on with, and we will intend to expose more of those and show more of those to you over the coming series of webinars. But at this point, I'd like to pause there and take the opportunity now to hand over to my colleague, Dr. Charlie Harrison. So Charlie's going to give us a little more insight into the importance and relevance of technical delivery and adoption and some of the key considerations in that space. Charlie, over to you.
Thank you very much, Rob. So I'm going to take a little step back into the abstract and then dive more into the specifics again. So this curve here is supposed to represent the rough course of an epidemic or pandemic in terms of the severity. And we've labeled it according to the WHO's guidance on the potential phases of an influenza pandemic, which was published back in 2009 and still relevant today. We're probably all used to seeing these kinds of curve diagrams by now. Governments have to make critical decisions at every point along this curve, and we can split it into roughly 3 consecutive stages. So in the early stage here, when the number and the rate of new infections is increasing rapidly, the focus is on planning and preparation. So the watchwords are prepare, protect, and delay. So that's prepare resources, prepare equipment, hospital capacity, healthcare systems, protect the population, and delay the rate of incoming infections to avoid a very steep curve, which could result in an overwhelm of the healthcare system. And the top level question that governments want to know here is, how might the disease spread? So how quickly is it spreading? What is the average infection rate? What kind of patterns of infection are we likely to see in the population? How fast will it move? How many consecutive infections are we likely to have? And also, what can we learn about other countries' experiences at this point? We're lucky enough to be behind those in the curve. And then moving forward onto the second stage, towards the peak of the epidemic, the focus shifts onto what measures should be taken and when. So most of the world's population has seen some form of lockdown, and there's a lot of controversy over the right moment to implement various social distancing measures. Governments have to decide what precise form these measures should take. So which businesses and services should be shut down and which should be kept running? Should social distancing be applied, and what kind of distance measures should be used? Where should it be allowed, in what spaces, and how much and how many people? Should these measures apply differently in different economic or geographic areas? Curfews and other partial social distancing measures are considered. And all of those things have to be carefully planned. And then moving forward, once the peak has passed, countries turn their attention to recovering from the major societal and economic shock. And this has to be done responsibly, of course. So it's a very complex puzzle, piecing back together the system of a country, how to restart operations safely without causing a second peak of infections, and deciding which parts of a nation are safe and which aren't, or which industries or areas or socio-demographic groups are recovering well and which might need more support. And then finally, throughout all of this process, there are questions around observing, monitoring, and assessing. So whichever measures have been implemented, are they working, and how well, and could we tweak them or improve them? maybe tighten them or ease them? Are some sectors of the population complying better than others? Does messaging need to be strengthened or targeted better? Are our predictions correct? And are resource allocations sufficient? And mobile data has a role to play in helping to address certainly many and possibly even all of these questions. So if we go on to the next slide, please. So how can mobile data generate insights to support the kinds of critical decisions that we've just discussed? So this diagram illustrates the generic process of adding value to mobile data, starting from the raw resource generated by various parts of the network, and eventually supporting impactful decisions. Mobile big data, of course, is not dissimilar to other types of modern big data sources in the broad steps required to obtain valuable, actionable insights. But there are broadly 3 stages. So I'll talk through those now. The vast majority of use cases that we see are looking at mobility. So that's population movements over time. And there are 3 types of MNO data particularly that are relevant for this. So on the far left of this diagram, you can see we have MNO data, and 3 types of data that MNOs possess and generate are as follows: customer data. So this is fairly static data about customers, generally used for customer relationship management. Then you have event data, which is data about interactions between customers and the network. This is very fast moving. So each event relates a single SIM card to a cell tower or a base station at a point in time. And this is the key, of course, to collecting location and mobility data over the whole customer base. And then finally, network data is about the network itself. So the locations of the towers, their operational status, and how much activity each tower is handling. And so in the first phase, the processing phase, these 3 types of data are pulled together and processed, cleansed to try and produce accurate, reliable results. This involves a lot of validation, quality assurance, filtering, so comparing to baseline ground truths to make sure that the signals that we're getting out are accurate and reasonable, controlling for potential sources of noise or bias. And all of these capabilities lie within operators. Operators are best placed to own this part of the system because it's their systems that generate the data and they know them better than anyone else. Then once the processed data is available, it feeds into the analytics phase. So this cleansed and processed data product can be combined with other data sources and then subjected to analysis to try to address specific research questions. And the specifics of this stage are heavily dependent on the project and the desired outcomes, but almost certainly involve data from other non-mobile sources. So for example, satellite data or survey data, population maps, infrastructure maps, other types of data from any number of other sources. And also the application of one or more specialized tools and techniques like geographical information systems, that's GIS, or machine learning or statistical analysis. And the expertise for this phase might sit within operators, or it might sit within demand-side agencies or governments, or it might be done by specialist third parties. And then finally, once the analysis is done, we have the packaging phase. And this is where the results are compiled into a usable format so that they can be incorporated into existing decision-making processes. And this packaging might produce a one-off report or a series of updated reports or a set of visualizations or something more sophisticated like a dashboard or an app or even a fully fledged decision support system. And there are several factors to consider when designing this output. Depends on what the demand side, the decision-making bodies are used to receiving and what they're capable of using. But what we're seeing in COVID is that there are a few specific types of aggregates that are proving useful in various types of packaged output. So if we go on to the next slide, I'll talk a bit about that. Thank you. So as I said, there are 4 types of aggregate location and mobility data, or network data that we've seen applied to COVID-19. The first one is dynamic population maps. So these are like regular population maps. They tell you how many people are in each place at a time. But that critical difference, the dimension, is that the time can vary. So they're updated regularly, and this allows them to respond to real fluctuations. So, for example, a dynamic population map might show daytime population versus nighttime population. Differences there, of course, arise from commuting patterns. Or it might show seasonal migration over different times of a year. These are used in COVID for resource planning, so where to put clinics or testing or treatment centers, for identifying gatherings or potential transmission hotspots, possibly relating to specific industrial activity, commercial activity. This can help to facilitate decisions about the recovery, so which parts to ease first. The second type is origin-destination matrices. So these represent travel between pairs of locations or regions. So there are lots of different ways to construct these based on different types of presence algorithms. So whether somebody has spent the majority of their time in a region or whether they've simply visited it, how to select a threshold, what kind of spatial granularity you might want to apply, or what time window, whether this should be absolute numbers or relative numbers, etc. So all of these different constructions have different strengths and weaknesses, but they all have uses in different ways. They're broadly used for modeling how an infection is likely to spread and monitoring movements between regions, and also to understand displacement, so mid to long term, how a population's drifting. The third type of aggregate is mobility measures. So these show how much people within a specific area are moving around. And this is typically calculated by taking an average metric for the residential population in an area. So for the people that live in a particular region, like a district, how many cells have they visited in the last 24 hours on average? Or some more sophisticated measures like the radius of gyration, which shows roughly the distance covered by people, or the percentage of non-work trips, or possibly the number of inter-regional trips, again, average per person. These are used for monitoring the level of obedience to movement restrictions, and also for proxying the amount of social contact between people, so to give an early indicator of the number of new infections that might emerge. And then the final type of aggregate is network activity. So this is the amount of traffic passing through specific portions of the network. And that can be broken down by call destination or service destination, to measure, for example, specific demand for services like calls to helplines, or as a measure of economic activity in some areas. And this is used for monitoring public concern or as a proxy for health service pressure, in order to predict, again, likely case numbers perhaps undetected by current testing measurements. And so at that point, I will pass back to Rob.
Great, thanks so much, Charlie. Really useful insight there at a high level around the technical delivery and adoption considerations if you're looking to develop a new mobile big data powered solution. The next element that we want to highlight for you is around the policy and privacy considerations that are relevant if you're in that context as well. So without further ado, I'll hand over to my colleague Jade Nestor, who's the Director of Consumer Policy at the GSMA. Jade, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Rob. Privacy is a key consideration in mobile big data analytics, and the mobile industry is committed to respecting and protecting privacy. We developed mobile privacy principles in 2011 to reflect this commitment. But in addition to these principles, when we're developing mobile big data analytics projects, it's important for mobile network operators and governments to consider whether the use of mobile data complies with requirements under different laws, regulations, and license conditions that might be in place in a particular country. As this slide notes, many countries, over 130, I believe, right now, are developing and revising existing privacy frameworks. In many of these countries, there are also other sectoral privacy and data requirements that are in place, such as specific telecommunications privacy requirements or confidentiality requirements. Those are often referred to as e-privacy type laws. Or there could be a license obligation, for example, dictating how subscriber information is used. This creates a complex legal landscape, and it can potentially create challenges for mobile operators and other stakeholders trying to build mobile big data analytics projects. Conflicting requirements can also cause confusion within governments because of uncertainty around competencies and enforcement cooperation mechanisms between authorities. It's important that all stakeholders comply with relevant requirements, but there are types of legal frameworks that can better facilitate mobile big data projects and really facilitate the data economy writ large. Next slide, please. This slide talks about the GSMA Smart Data Privacy Laws report and reflects our position that builds on the mobile privacy principles that I described earlier. We've engaged with governments and stakeholders around the world, and we developed this report in June 2019 reflecting many of those conversations around developing privacy laws. The report identifies common elements and principles included in, quote, smart data privacy laws around the world. At a high level, this report notes that for a data privacy law to be successful, it must, of course, provide effective protection for individuals. Implementing a smart privacy law can streamline privacy requirements for operators, particularly if a smart privacy law replaces conflicting or potentially duplicative sectoral requirements that might appear in the laws and license obligations that we showed in the previous slide. Some of the primary elements of smart data privacy laws are reflected on this slide. For example, accountability. This is really the bedrock on which all of the other elements of a smart privacy law can be built. Organizations should be liable for what they do with personal data. But accountability doesn't just mean liable in law. It goes beyond compliance. It's about the law explicitly providing that organizations must be able to demonstrate to individuals and to supervisory authorities, such as data protection authorities, that they have a program put in place that provides comprehensive and effective privacy measures. This is about having policies, processes, and practices all working together in an organization to make sure everyone in the organization knows how to protect privacy and knows how to provide individuals with rights to protect privacy. Additionally, a smart privacy law should be horizontal. A general data privacy law, for example, the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe, applies to any processing of personal data regardless of sector or technology. This represents a positive for consumers as it gives them consistent protection without having to worry about what technology they're using or whether the activity they're engaged in has specific rules or not. A horizontal privacy law should be considered if a law is being put in place or if the legal framework is being overhauled, because it provides a useful opportunity for governments to review legacy sectoral rules that might create that confusing regulatory landscape we discussed earlier. Additionally, this type of law should be principles-based, and in general, a data protection law requirement shouldn't be too prescriptive. It should be future-proof and technology-neutral. If you have a principles-based law, there's some flexibility there where you're thinking through principles like transparency, purpose specification, data minimization, security, and giving users meaningful choices and respecting those choices. This is about thinking through how you interact with the consumer and making sure that any service or product that you're rolling out, including mobile big data analytics products, are clear to consumers, understandable, and that consumers can make reasonable choices. Additionally, a big part of a principles-based framework is also a focus on the risk of harm to individuals. Rather than talking about very specific use cases in the law, it's better to think about whether a use case has a risk of harm, poses a risk of harm to individuals, and then how that harm can be mitigated and prevented before a service or product is put on the market. Additionally, it's important to think beyond just consent for these types of laws. We hear a lot about data privacy rules being based purely on consent, and while that is one ground for processing data, there should be other grounds for processing data as well. Sometimes relying on individual opt-in consent can lead to consent fatigue for the individual, and that is not a great outcome for people. Additionally, sometimes further processing of personal data should be permitted. This means in practice, if a mobile operator is processing data for the purposes of connectivity, they may be able to use that data secondarily for providing mobile big data analytics, depending on whether they put adequate safeguards on the use of that data to make sure that the use is limited and that the data cannot be re-identified. Privacy by design is an important concept in privacy in general, and that's another part of this discussion, which really should apply to mobile big data analytics writ large. As you are developing a product or a service, you need to think about privacy at the outset and through the entire life cycle of the product. This makes sure that if you put something out in the market, that you're still thinking about updating it. If it's an IoT device, for example, you're updating it to make sure that it's at the state of the art and that there's not a vulnerability that you haven't missed. And then the last point to cover, which we'll discuss a little bit more later on, is that a smart privacy law also promotes data flows, that it allows personal data to flow across borders. This can be very important in the context of mobile big data analytics, and we'll discuss this later. Next slide, please. Now, I've mentioned a lot about what a good framework for mobile big data privacy looks like, but moving to specific implementation projects that the GSMA has been involved in. The GSMA AI for I initiative from its inception looked at privacy and how to ensure privacy and really how to ensure privacy and ethics. Any insights involved in the AI for Impact program are based on aggregated anonymized data, which Charlie covered in the previous discussion. And this was guided by a code of conduct that we established, which operators conducting trials under the initiative were required to adhere to. This is in addition to any specific regulatory requirements that an operator would be under in their particular jurisdiction. We maintain that those requirements, any regulatory requirements on the ground, should always be identified and respected for mobile big data analytics projects. And in order to do this, there may need to be engagement between the relevant stakeholders to clarify areas of regulatory ambiguity or to respond to governmental concerns about some potential privacy issues. So it's really important to establish when you would need to talk to a privacy regulator or some other regulator with competency at the outset of the project to make sure that everyone is aligned. But I should note again that this code of conduct that we developed for AI for Impact was building on the GSMA privacy principles, but it went beyond just principles and just complying with regulatory and legal requirements, and was thinking about best practices in a modern way, including ethical best practices. Next slide, please. In the specific context of COVID-19, we recognize that accurate, up-to-date information on aggregated mobility patterns could be potentially vital for monitoring, predicting outbreaks, and planning future resource needs, such as testing kits, medical staff, or equipment. Other use cases may include identifying people who have been in contact with confirmed cases or informing people if they've entered an affected area. And my colleagues mentioned this a little bit earlier. The mobile industry has recognized the urgency with which governments have had to act to stem the flow of COVID-19, and we understand that some governments are seeking to use data to help with these efforts. At the same time, we recognize that the use of mobile network operator data by governments or agencies raises serious privacy concerns. These guidelines that we developed in April 2020 reflect recommendations on how the mobile industry may maintain trust while responding to those governments and public health agencies that have sought assistance in the fight against COVID-19. The overarching principles of those COVID-19 privacy guidelines are that mobile big data use must be lawful, transparent, and time-bound. That's really how you make sure that there is trust in governments and mobile operators using this data. Additionally, the privacy guidelines go into detail about definitions for different types of data, how to consider compliance with the law and consideration of ethics, more detail on ensuring transparency between the parties and between governments and consumers, and then also specific assurances to ask from governments and other agencies, including that a request for data must be lawful, transparent, the purpose of the data use must be limited, there must be access controls in place, there must be an exit strategy or a sunset clause that stops the use of that data at a certain point, and all of the parties must be accountable for adherence to these guidelines and principles. Next slide, please. One additional point to make here about privacy and data is about how cross-border data flows can play a critical role. And I think we're seeing this in the context of COVID, where there are very high-level discussions about how research can be made more efficient. At a high level, free movement of data enables the internet economy. But in the context of mobile big data analytics, this is also applicable. For example, if a country has requirements that prevent access to data across borders, transfers of data across borders, this can impede or prohibit mobile big data analytics projects. For example, if an operator with a multinational footprint has a data scientist in one country and data in another country, and the operator may need to transfer or provide access to data to enable analytics, they need to get that data to their data scientist regardless of where the person is located. If there's a data localization requirement in place, such a requirement to use in-country servers, for example, can prevent analysis of the data, and this can impede the entire project. If an operator instead takes steps to ensure that data privacy is respected and protected regardless of the location of the data, then everyone, including consumers and governments, can trust that the data will be safe. And there are various measures that can be put in place, and the GSMA website provides information on this in one of our reports, Cross-Border Data Flows, Realizing Benefits and Removing Barriers. But just to wrap up this section on privacy and policy, we want to ensure the bottom line here is that there's trust and accountability between all of the parties involved in mobile big data analytics. This is critical. This trust can be achieved through compliance with existing requirements and implementation of tools like codes of conduct to ensure that all of the parties are adhering to best practice principles. Additionally, creating smart data privacy frameworks that are risk-based, principles-based, and horizontal can create a clearer legal framework for mobile big data analytics. Thank you. I'll move over to Hillary now. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jade, for giving us an insight there into the policy and privacy considerations that help inform the condition about to provide an enabling environment for mobile big data analytics solutions. So last but not least on our agenda today is Hillary Kemp, who's the Strategic Product Manager for the AI for Impact team at the GSMA. And Hillary's going to talk to us around the topic of funding and sustainability, which is really looking at what is needed to enable realization of sustainable mobile data solutions and other relevant applications in the long term. Hillary, over to you.
Thank you, Rob. First, let me set the context for the subject of sustainability and funding. Mobile big data products and services have been adopted in many countries. There are a range of situations in which they've been used as a decision support tool for governments and development agencies. This may be in response to a crisis, like the current pandemic, or as part of strategic planning activities. However, there are still few instances of mobile data products being adopted and used in the long term and at large scale. So what does it take to make these data solutions sustainable? Developing and supporting sustainable products and services, which can be replicated and enhanced over time, requires ongoing investment by mobile operators. In addition, data analytics and AI is a fast-developing field, and to offer the best solutions means that mobile operators must find ways to invest in innovation. And all of this drives the need for business models that are sustainable in the long term. Without such sustainable business models, the promise of mobile data analytics and AI will be hard to deliver, and the benefits to society will be difficult to realise. Before we look at types of business model and what makes a business model sustainable, let's take a step back. Could I move to the next slide, please? So why is a business model needed? What exactly is being funded by a business model? In simple terms, it's the work done by the mobile operator to create the output in the format required by their customer. This involves a number of data processing stages, the application of analysis techniques, and finally the development of products and services that present the output in the format required. This work involves specialist expertise, mobile network expertise, data science expertise, AI expertise, product development expertise, and possibly more, in order to fully address the customer's requirements. It also involves very high capacity data storage, analytical tools and platforms, visualization software, in some cases bespoke technical solutions, and the development of products and services that present the customer with the output in the way that they can make use of, which in some instances may also require integration into the customer's existing systems and processes. So mobile operators who offer big data analytics and AI products and services need to have a source of income to enable them to invest in this expertise and these technical capabilities. Could we move to the next slide, please? The forthcoming Sustainability and Funding webinar will also explore the types of business models that are used to support mobile big data analytic work and the situations in which each may be used. It will also examine the role of the business model in helping to deliver long-term impact. Here are the types of business model that will be presented. This is a very quick sort of tour through each of the ones that appear on this particular visual. A philanthropic model in which mobile data analysis and insights are provided pro bono. A donor subsidized model where costs are covered by external donor funding. A cross-subsidized model where costs are covered by revenue from other big data projects. A tiered model, which is free or trial-based with some elements of work paid for directly. And then finally, a fully sustainable model where there is a charging model agreed with the customer and the business model effectively stands alone. It does not require any other product, project, or external donor to provide the financial input to fund it on an ongoing basis. The Sustainability and Funding webinar will cover each of these models in detail and will evaluate approaches to making mobile data products and services sustainable over the long term. And now I'd like to hand back to Rob.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Hilary. You've helped me a little bit there with my next activity. If we could move to the next slide, please. So the first thing I'd like to do is to thank all of the presenters today, starting with Charlie talking around the technical delivery aspects and adoption, Jade looking at the privacy and the policy elements, and Hilary finally talking to us around sustainability and funding. These were not intended to be deep, in-depth insights into these elements. If you are immediately keen to seek out more information related to those themes, you have the opportunity to visit the AI for Impact Digital Toolkit, which is available at aiForImpactToolkit.gsma.com. Within that, you'll find greater level of information on the topics discussed today, as well as an opportunity there to, for example, look at the case study portfolio, which will give more detail on some of the examples that were alluded to in the presentation that you've seen today. But if you're interested to learn more about the specific topics that we've covered in this webinar, we are intending to have subject-specific deep dive sessions. So just moving then on to the final slide. Again, referring to that point about the in-depth session. So over the coming months, AI for Impact is actually going to be publishing a series of blogs and webinars on continuing on the theme of using mobile big data analytics to combat challenges, including COVID-19. So the first of those sessions will be on the policy and privacy subject, around the conditions that provide an enabling environment. Followed by the technical delivery and adoption focus, which is looking at the infrastructure and the knowledge for the generation, implementation and integration of insights into decision-making tools. And then the third of those will be on the funding and sustainability theme that Hillary's just spoken to us about, looking to understand what's required to enable realization of sustainable mobile data solutions to address challenges such as COVID-19 that we are facing presently, but also some of the other applications, for example, those that are available in the digital toolkit that I mentioned a moment ago. Those sessions are going to involve contributions from mobile operator experts. They will go into greater depth than we've covered here today, to bring insights for both mobile operators and for governments who are wishing to develop impactful mobile data analytics capabilities. So we really do hope that you will be able to join us for those. If you would like to register your interest now for the webinar series, you're welcome to do so. Please email us on industrypurposeevents@gsma.com. And if you would like any further information around the AI for Impact initiative, the link is also on the screen for you. So the very last thing I would like to do is to conclude the session is to thank our speakers today, Dr. Charlie Harrison, Jade Nestor and Hilary Kemp. And we really do hope that you'll be able to join us again for the deep dive sessions over the coming weeks. Thank you, everyone.